For much of the second half of the 20th century, China was perceived as a vast nation struggling with internal upheaval, poverty, and a largely agrarian economy. Yet by the early decades of the 21st century, China emerged as the world's second-largest economy in nominal GDP terms. And, by some estimates, such as Purchasing Power Parity or PPP, it has even surpassed the United States. This transformation is so massive, so swift, and so unprecedented in modern economic history. But there's one country that may have helped China to become economically successful: the United States. The United States is long known as the world's largest consumer market, a leader in technological innovation, and a global political powerhouse. But through each of these factors, China has in some ways benefited from them. But before we talk about how that specifically happened, it is first important to look back in history. From the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in 1949 until the late 1970s, China operated a centrally planned economy. What this simply meant was that the government itself, led by the Chinese Communist Party, was the primary decision-maker in all economic activities. Private enterprise was nearly non-existent, and market forces played little to no role in shaping the economy. The results of this approach were mixed. While China achieved some successes in areas like industrialization and infrastructure development, it remained a largely closed, poor, and underdeveloped nation compared to global standards. Here's a graph on China's nominal GDP, data from the World Bank. In 1960, the latest data available in World Bank's database shows that China's GDP stood at only $59.72 billion. By 1978, it was only $149 billion. The growth over these decades was rather minimal. Here's another graph on the annual GDP growth from the same source. Here, you can see that China's economic growth was good in some years. For instance, in 1978, it grew over 11.3%. But along these decades, there were contractions, and slowdown, which overall didn't really make a lot of difference. By the early 1970s, however, China began to show tentative signs of openness to the outside world. US President Richard Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in 1972 eased decades of estrangement, paving the way for some level of economic engagement with the West. However, it was only until the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping rose to power, that actually changed everything. He championed the concept of reform and opening up. Deng Xiaoping's policies steered China away from strict Maoist economics toward a socialist market economy, a hybrid model where the state still held significant power but allowed market mechanisms to operate. Along these years, a pivotal event occurred in 1979. Then, US President Jimmy Carter had granted diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. This led to trade agreements and investments coming from the United States. But it wasn't until the United States had implemented a crucial policy called Most Favored Nation status. China received its first Most Favored Nation status under President Reagan in the 1980s. Having a designated Most Favored Nation status means that a trading partner is offered the same tariff rates and trade advantages that the US offers its most favored trade partners. This has then led to an exponential increase in trade between the two countries. The MFN status basically allowed Chinese goods to enter the US market with minimal tariffs, making them highly competitive. They were, in simpler words, cheap goods. China, which was facing export taxes to the United States, could now export them without those very same taxes. So you could imagine how this was going. To top it off, Deng Xiaoping was pushing for China to become an export-driven economy, whilst the United States was allowing them to enter their market with a most favored nation status. And you also have to understand that back then, Chinese manufacturers capitalized on low production costs. salaries in China were low as compared to American salaries. For instance, here's a graph on the median income or consumption per day in China from 1981 to 1999. Data adjusted for inflation and for differences in the cost of living between countries. Here, you can see that in 1981, China's median income or consumption per day was a mere small figure of just $1.02. Comparatively, if we add the United States here, we get to see a huge difference. The United States, in 1981, had a median income or consumption per day of over $41.55. That's a difference of over 40 times between the two countries. This stark income disparity was a key driver behind the cost advantage of Chinese manufacturing. With labor costs being a fraction of those in the United States, Chinese factories could produce goods at significantly lower prices. This cost efficiency was attractive to US companies, which began outsourcing production to China in droves during the 1980s and 1990s. But back to the most favored nation status, that agreement was renewed once more by President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. He and his administration cited the importance of engagement and the potential for shaping China's global outlook through commerce. By 2000, US Congress had decided to grant permanent normal trade relations, PNTR, to China, removing the need for annual renewal. This pushed bilateral trade between the two economies to rise. But most importantly, it pushed exports from China to the United States. Here's a graph on the exports from China to the US from 1985 to 2000, data from the US Census Bureau. Here you can see that in 1985, exports were just a small sum of $3.8 billion. But as the MFN status was implemented and renewed, and US-China relationships were becoming good, exports rose. As you can see, in 2000, it rose to a massive $100 billion. That is an increase of over 2,500% in just 15 years. And what's important about this export is the fact that a lot of them, especially in the early years, were driven by American companies. As we mentioned earlier, some of the factors that made China a key manufacturing hub was its low salary. Hence, early investors like General Motors and Ford engaged in joint ventures with Chinese state-owned automotive firms. This allowed them to establish production lines in China, access Chinese consumers, and benefit from lower production costs for export. Large tech corporations, including Microsoft, Intel, and eventually Apple, set up extensive operations in China, from research centers to massive manufacturing facilities, often through contract manufacturers like Foxconn. These joint ventures, contract manufacturers, were then exporting the products back to the United States or other international markets. This paved the way for people to get employed, businesses to rise, and most importantly, it meant that money was flowing into China rather than out. As they were producing goods in their local borders, they were then receiving money for it, for selling them or exporting them in other countries. This was an important aspect for China's economic rise. Here's a graph on the United States direct investment abroad into China, data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Here you can see that in every single year, the investments have risen. Of course, it's not a substantial amount. In 2000, it amounted to just $11 billion. But while it is small, what you should know is that the true drivers of exports from China to the United States are contract manufacturers. For instance, Foxconn, one of the largest contract manufacturers in the world, became a key player in China's manufacturing success. Headquartered in Taiwan, but operating extensively in China, Foxconn partnered with major US technology companies like Apple, Dell, and Hewlett-Packard. These partnerships enabled the production of high-quality electronics at scale, with China serving as the primary manufacturing hub. This ecosystem of contract manufacturing allowed Chinese labor, infrastructure, and logistics to converge into a highly efficient system, further boosting exports. And it's not just exports that matters here as well. It's also the fact that American companies were bringing their own technology into China. An important aspect of foreign direct investment in China was the technology transfer that often accompanied it. The Chinese government routinely required foreign firms to form joint ventures with local Chinese partners, particularly in key industries like automotive, aerospace, and high-tech manufacturing. Under these joint venture agreements, Chinese firms gained access to advanced technologies, production methods, and managerial expertise. For instance, General Motors formed a joint venture, Shanghai GM, with SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation. Over time, SAIC engineers learned sophisticated production methods and processes from GM. Eventually, SAIC began developing its own line of vehicles, leveraging the acquired know-how. Finally, one of the most important external catalysts for China's economic boom was its accession to the World Trade Organization, WTO, in December 2001. Before joining, China had already been negotiating tariff reductions and policy changes with key players, including the United States and the European Union. From the US perspective, supporting China's WTO membership was grounded in a belief that integrating China into the rules-based global trading system would encourage further liberalization and potentially lead to political reforms. For China, WTO membership was about securing stable, predictable access to global markets, especially the US market. Upon joining the WTO, China agreed to cut import tariffs on a wide array of goods, open more sectors to foreign competition, and adhere to globally accepted standards for intellectual property and dispute resolution. The immediate effect was a significant surge in Chinese exports. Here's a graph on China's merchandise exports. Here you can see that in every year, from the 1980s to 2000, China's exports were growing fast. This was driven in part due to their exports in the United States. But if we adjust this graph and include later years, we get to see a big explosion in growth for China's merchandise exports. And indeed, a very important reason for this is no other than their ascension into the WTO. And there has been one important person who played a role in pushing China to join the WTO, and that is former President Bill Clinton. President Clinton, on March 8, 2000, had even delivered a speech to Washington's foreign policy elite, Congress, and the international community on the merits of China's accession to the World Trade Organization. Clinton believed that engaging China through trade would not only benefit the US economy, but also encourage China to adopt global norms and practices. Hence, you can already tell just how much the United States helped China. They basically gave them access to their local markets, which is the largest in the world. Then, US corporations channeled billions of dollars in foreign direct investment into China. Through joint ventures, American companies transferred management expertise, manufacturing processes, and technological know-how. Thirdly, they backed China's entry into the WTO and granted them permanent normal trade relations. The US basically facilitated China's integration into the global economy. That is why it is easy to see just how the United States helped China become to where it is today. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.